Hey, Sean, welcome to The Finder. Welcome to the podcast. It's your first time on The Finder, but it is not the first time that you and I have talked about the NBA and gambling and the Tim Donaghy scandal. When all these the Jontay Porter story happened, when Shohei Ohtani happened, hell, when the Alabama baseball coach story happened, I was like, there's no one on planet Earth I would rather talk to about these contemporary scandals than Sean Patrick Griffin. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Tom. Love it.
You're a professor of criminology at the Citadel. You also wrote Gaming the Game, which is the definitive guide to the Tim Donaghy scandal. It is the one book that if you wanted to know what really happened or the entire scope of Tim Donaghy's scandal, not just about from Tim Donaghy's point of view, which we'll get into, but the whole thing, it really opens the world into sports gambling and how it all goes down and how it all plays off each other and how something like the Tim Donaghy scandal could have started from one Philly coach graduating from Cardinal O'Hara in Delco County into this huge story. I guess I should say, how often do you get mentioned about the Tim Donaghy story? How often does it come up in your day-to-day as a professor? You wrote this book. You've written other books about organized crime. But how often does the Tim Donaghy story come up in your life?
I'm not exaggerating. It's almost daily. And you have to realize that book was written in 2011. And yet here we are in 2024, and it just won't go away. Look, that was sort of true before we legalized sports gambling a few years ago. Now, oh my goodness, it's just nonstop.
Which story interests you the most?
Oh, I would say the Porter story. And can I tell you why?
Yeah, please.
Back when we were discussing, when legalization was being proposed, the focus for the most part, rightly, was on game outcomes. I understood that. But my whole argument was, and it's partly because I converse so many times with people about this, people who follow, instead of looking at the NBA or the NFL, things that we would focus on in the United States, if you look at international gambling, obviously soccer is number one, but if you look below that, you look at a lot of betting on things like tennis. And when we were talking about legalization, my whole thing was, and this is before legalization, so my focus at the time was on fantasy sports. And my whole thing was, well, why would somebody not foot fault in tennis if they know that a buddy, or if you owe a debt to somebody, there are many, many ways. What are the odds that you're going to double fault in tennis? And you can go through any number of possible ways that you would be affecting fantasy sports. And back then people would say, yeah, that's true, but you can't get a lot of money down on some bet like that. And it would take a lot of activity to do that. I understood that. I wasn't debating that. But my point was, it's almost undetectable. Because how would you ever know when you're getting into that granular level of nuance in any match, game, whatever? There's no way to prove that. And so when the Porter thing happened, I was thinking, oh my goodness, this is literally what I was talking about 10 years ago. And now it's, obviously not fantasy sports, it's real sports and it's prop bets. And you are seeing what people said, which is, well, in fairness, the betting totals are not that much. But that doesn't matter. It's the principle that it's a struggle, whether it's legalized or not. I don't know how you can ever detect something like that. And I read your great piece on that, where if someone was going to try and assess whether there really was something noteworthy about what Porter did in those two games, you'd have to do what you did in your piece. But even you, because you're a professional, said, well, you can't say definitively. And that's the problem.
Yeah, and isn't that kind of the problem with the Donaghy story, is that you had FBI agents who didn't really know much about basketball trying to prove one way or the other or find evidence that he was possibly throwing games or being compromised with his officiating one side or the other. If you watch an NBA game, it's even if you get 10 referees in a room, 10 referee experts in a room, and you say, is that evidence of any sort of, funny business going on? They'll probably have half the room say, oh, that's a foul, not a foul. So how could you even, assess whether something was thrown or fixed in the first place? And I would say, well, the betting data is one thing. Right. And you talk about this with Tim Donaghy is like, you can trust Tim Donaghy or not, what he says. You can trust what Jimmy Batista says, who's a co-conspirator, who is a professional gambler, one of the most famous sports gamblers of that time. You can trust what they say or not, but you can't dispute the numbers. You can't dispute Jontay Porter's stats, and you can't dispute the betting data going on before the games. And now we have DraftKings self-reporting in a sense, saying like, we had tons of money trying to lay down these bets on these unders with Jontay Porter, who's a fringe NBA player, and they were the top money makers the next day, which doesn't that say to me that they accepted some of these bets, Sean, in your understanding of how this whole world works, by saying it's the top money maker the next day? Isn't that suggesting that they did accept bets on Jontay Porter?
Yeah, that's my understanding. And by the way, we joked at the onset that there have been a slew of scandals since legalization. In a couple of those, they were flagged and the bets were not permitted, which is how we learned about them. To my understanding, that's not what happened in the Porter situation.
Yeah, and the Porter situation is interesting to me because there's so many player prop bets out there. There's so many of them. If you need proof, just know that Jontay Porter has a player prop bet, right, and he's on a two-way contract. And the one thing that I think the NBA should do, or at least the sports book should do, is eliminate the 0.5 3-point attempts over-unders on player props. Because like you said with the double fault, you can control that if you're a player. Like, you can absolutely fudge or influence the number of 3-point attempts you have, right?
Yeah, without affecting the game outcome. Yeah,
it doesn't affect the game
outcome, so they can rationalize it and it doesn't get flagged.
Right. So the fact that they were offering 0.5 3-pointers made for Jontay Porter is, to me, something they got to pull back. And you're seeing the NCAA, they want to pull back player props, and then in the spirit of amateurism and protecting the integrity of the game. You might roll your eyes at that because, it's the NCAA, but also I think they're right to an extent that some of these player props are just waiting to be fixed or waiting to be manipulated.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is when you're doing in-game betting and you can bet the next point, the next serve, and all that sort of stuff. That's what I'm saying. People, in my opinion, were not thinking through how many ways you can gamble because they were focusing on these huge bets of outcomes. Well, when you look within the game, holy smokes, you can go crazy with, $2,000 here or $5,000 there or whatever. And, there was, I forget the NFL player who was suspended last summer. He was only making $850,000 a year, $850,000 a year. And he was asked, well, why would you risk that for whatever? And that's what people, I think, on the outside still don't get. They're all trying to make rational conversations or put their own head into somebody else's decisions. Well, people don't make rational decisions. And his answer to that, by the way, wasn't, oh, well, I had this, or this reason. His answer was, I didn't think I'd get caught. It wasn't that, I thought I was going to make all this, or I was addicted to gambling, or anything like this. I didn't think I was going to get caught. So, people are making these decisions, and the fact that you're not getting $100,000 down on a game when you're making hundreds of thousands or millions. Well, that may not be the impulse.
Right. The player you're talking about is Calvin Ridley, the wide receiver. Yeah. And I don't know what to do with that argument. Not the one you presented, but this argument is, well, there's too much money in the NBA. No one would ever throw a game. So the idea is, look, these guys are making $30 million a year in the NBA. Not in the case with Jontay Porter. He makes $415,000 on a two-way contract if he fulfills his guarantees, et cetera, et cetera. So it's big money for the average American, but like NBA standard, like Stephen Curry's making $50 million this year. And that's just in his NBA salary. He's making a lot more than that for Under Armour and CarMax, et cetera. So what do you make of the idea that, like, if Tim Donaghy made more money, he wouldn't have gambled on NBA games? Does that pass the smell test for you, who's studied organized crime as much as anybody?
Well, I not only study organized crime, I study white collar crime. And that's why, in my line of work, if you study sociology or criminology, you see a lot of people who argue that poverty causes crime. Well, if you study white collar or organized crime for a living, You never hear that from the people you interview or any of the data you collect. I mean, these are people, whether it's an organized crime, they're doing it because they think it's ridiculous that you and I are on this podcast right now as suckers in their view. They're out, hanging out, enjoying. They're not incredibly wealthy, but they're living the life. They're enjoying their lives. And white collar crime, oh my goodness, there are so many people who are involved in white collar crimes. Some of them are doing it for the rush, no different than people jumping out of perfectly fine airplanes or off of cliffs. They're trying to do hustles to see, and there are other people you interview who are fascinating. They're trying to see what they can get away with. They're fascinated by testing systems, whether it's getting flagged by the IRS or the SEC or whatever. And that's why, this is off topic, but CNBC used to have a TV show called Greed, American Greed, and there would be that deep overtone, American Greed. And the assumption was that all these financial scams were based on somebody wanting more money. People are involved in these things for any number of reasons. Power, especially when it comes to gambling. One of the things that's never discussed, plenty of the players who've been caught, either in the pros or in college, have said, "Well, I was betting for another person." That might well be true, but in my experience, I've seen people gamble just to impress people. Oh, you don't think I can do that? Oh, why? Either it's a buddy, a college roommate, a girlfriend, a potential girlfriend. Oh, watch that. So trying to assess motivations is incredibly hard. And yet people, for some reason, are way too comfortable saying, oh, that would never happen for X reason. You don't know. People are goofy. By the way, people are allowed to be irrational momentarily. Long term, they can be, addicted to any number of substances. They can be mentally unstable, again, temporarily or long term. So trying to assess why somebody does something is incredibly challenging. And look, in the case of Donaghy, he was hustling long before the NBA betting scandal, and he's been hustling since. So anybody you ever interview about Donaghy will tell you this isn't even about money for him. He's just that kind of guy. He's just constantly, always on the move, doing whatever. And again, his motivations, who the heck knows, but whether it's financial avarice or whatever. But yeah, no, he could have been making way more than he was, and I don't think it would have changed a thing.
Right. And it's not necessarily that a referee or a player will be betting large sums of money or not betting large sums of money, depending on how many zeros are in his bank account, or getting caught up in it. Because we have this smoldering case in baseball right now where the guy signs a $700 million deal, and yet he is enraptured. He's caught up in this gambling scandal where $4.5 million is being wired from his account to settle a debt with a bookie, an illegal bookie. And so the argument that Jontay Porter, yeah, he's a bit player, it's a fringe guy, but not the Devin Bookers, the Steph Currys, the LeBrons of the world, the KDs of the world, they're never going to be tempted to bet on games because they give away too much. They give up too much. And I'm like, you don't think Shohei Ohtani is making a lot of money? Like, he's making as much money as any player in Major League Baseball history. And he is caught up in this as well. And whether he was making those bets or not, they're denying that he had any knowledge of it, that he has never bet on baseball, and they're deny. But you don't have to go far to be caught up in a gambling scandal, no matter how much money you make, right?
Well, by the way, using that particular example, let's take him at his word that he wasn't involved and that he simply was covering the bets, or whatever, however that story evolves, that he's not actually involved gambling. But the point is, what if we change one little fact in that narrative, which is that, okay, fine, the guy owes $4.5 million, but instead of just using the money, he's going to wager, and he's going to ask Ohtani to do something in a game or do something over a period of games. Right? That's not irrational, especially if it's a close friend, a loved one, or whatever. Because again, then you're away from the fact that he's crazy wealthy. If for whatever reason, these parties are rationalizing this in their head, especially if it's not affecting game outcomes, you can see this happening in any number of ways.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about the Jontay Porter story is it wasn't that DraftKings caught Jontay Porter betting on NBA games. Would you have suspected that the first gambling scandal in the NBA since Donaghy, like, I'm just calling it that, even though we haven't found all the facts yet or the investigation's ongoing, it's not that he was found betting. It was that there was betting activity based on this under that was raising red flags. Was that surprising to you, that the way that it started ringing alarm bells was not because of tracking his phone or he was placing a bet? It was actually this other separate thing that was going on. And how does that, Sean, relate to the Donaghy scandal? How if you wanted to look in the right places, you could have spotted the scandal happening, that he was betting on games and having a wild success rate on his own games and not having a good success rate on the quote unquote inside information on other games that he wasn't working. Donaghy, for the record, Sean, could you explain how you could have, even without the wiretap on the mob family, you might have spotted Tim Donaghy well before that whole wiretap happened?
Well, let me tell your audience, and I say this almost every time I appear with you, Tom and I don't talk. This is the first time he and I have spoken since the last time I was on. And you would think that he and I chat all the time based on his questions because he teased me up for these things. That's an amazing question. All right, well, I'll answer your second part first about Donaghy. My argument all along has been that, for those who don't know, it wasn't an 06-07 NBA scandal.
It wasn't.
For some reason, that has become the common narrative. Donaghy started betting on his own games as early as 2003. He at least admits to 2003. And then he bet on dozens of his own games through 03-04, 04-05, 05-06, and 06-07. Well, my argument all along was, and you can track this with the betting lines, and that's where Tom was going. If you simply looked at Donaghy's betting lines versus the rest of the referees' betting lines in the NBA, that alone would have told you something. And for those who don't know, part of the reason you think what you think, unless you watch what Tom does or read what Tom does for a living, or a few other people, but very few, and you're unfortunately just still believing the common narrative that started in 2009 when Donaghy got released from prison and released his book. The whole idea that this was not able to be researched by either the NBA or the FBI, my argument was, when Donaghy approached the FBI proactively, very, very smart move by his lawyer, because that meant without the two conspirators, Tommy Martino, his friend, and Jimmy Batista, as Tom said earlier, the pro gambler, they were not cooperating with the government. So Donaghy's word was going to dictate that investigation, because they didn't have access to Batista's betting, the electronic betting records. They didn't have access to his laptop, his colleagues, or whatever. So for the beginning of the investigation, Donaghy's word carried the day. And that's why, if they had had access to just the betting line data, which doesn't require a search warrant, it's public information, they could have either asked politely for Don Best, that monitors all the different betting lines like I did, or heck, even paid the fee for, whatever, $5 or $6 grand, whatever it was at the time, for a Don Best subscription. They could have done the assessment themselves and then investigate Donaghy and then query him. Because my whole thing was, once Donaghy started giving his BS, they could have called Bull and said, no, look, we have the lines. So you're not going to tell us that, this didn't happen and that, but they didn't have any of that. That's one of the easiest things. And by the way, one other thing that you didn't mention, Tom, but you know this, they also could have, once they saw that, they could have looked at the call splits in his games. The call splits in most games for referees are fairly equal. If it's 14 for one team, it's 12 or 11 for the other. They're not wildly off. His splits were crazy off, 12-6, 13-5, stuff like that. None of these in and of themselves, of course, proves anything. But if you have access, as they did, to one of the co-conspirators who's trying to cut a deal with the government, well, you present him with all this information and say, okay, well, explain this, explain that. And at a minimum, they would have been less receptive to believing the rest of his nonsense, because they would have known, a good law enforcement officer would know right away, oh, come on, look, I don't know exactly what happened here, but it's not what he's saying. And unfortunately, they didn't know. Look, but by the way, in fairness to them, they obviously realized they had no expertise in watching game tape. And by the way, for people who don't know the story, Donaghy told the FBI he didn't remember what games he wagered on. So if you're the FBI and you're trying to look at game tapes, well, what games are you going to pick? Your informant claims he can't remember what games.
Yeah,
so
they work 60 games a year. So you got 240 games that you have to pick from. And even getting those game logs, probably back in 2008 or 2009, like finding those game logs, it takes a long time to figure out what, okay, all right, well, which games, was it Tuesday or Thursday? Oh, I was on the Tuesday game. Was I on Thursday? All right, well, let's just go look it up. Then you got to watch the 240 games and finding those game tapes. And that takes forever to go through and sift through. So,
and don't forget, you're an FBI agent. You're not Tom Haberstroh. They don't know what they're looking at. And so it was again, I'm not criticizing the investigation. What could we ask them to do? But for people like Donaghy, and unfortunately a lot of people in the media, to then say, as they do in headlines, FBI or NBA concludes Donaghy didn't fix games. That never happened. That not only didn't happen, the FBI explicitly wrote in his plea agreement, which Donaghy signed, that he agreed that his on-court actions, by definition, affected. His off-court actions, the gambling, by definition, affected his on-court behavior. And they use the word subconsciously in the plea agreement, but they knew at some level it had to have happened. So anyway, that's the way that Donaghy's investigation could have gone differently from the beginning. And one last thing, Tom, I'll stop.
Yeah.
The 06-07 season is different than 03 to 06 because there, oh my goodness, for people who don't know, and Tom's audience probably knows, but if you don't, betting lines in NBA games don't move all that much. They're not up for that long, whereas obviously an NFL game's up for 7 days, so you have a lot of time to move the line. Things happen, injuries, whatever. Well, NBA games don't move that much. They move maybe a point or two. Anything over that means either there's a major injury we don't know about, or there's coaching, something like that. Donaghy's games, the games Donaghy was officiating, were flying like crazy in 06-07 because by then, Jimmy Batista, the pro gambler, is actively involved in the conspiracy at that point. For the first 3 years, he's just copying the bets. As of 06-07,
Cannon's bets. So
yes, exactly. Yes,
Donaghy's betting with his buddy Jack Concannon, who's his bookie, and the Jack would then bet on Donaghy's games on top of that, right? So, then Jimmy Batista, who's the pro, and the animals, right? His
betting crew,
his betting crew catches wind of, wait, this guy, his bets are just on fire.
But only on Donaghy's games.
And that's an important distinction.
Yeah. What people may not remember, Jack Concannon was betting on NBA games and he was losing just like the rest of us. And then all of a sudden he starts winning on certain games. And not only was he winning on those games, he was betting far more. He was betting more than double on those particular games. And they were winning at 78% of the time. And for non-gamblers, if you don't know, winning 78% of the time, even for pro gamblers, is unheard of. So they didn't know. Look, the pro gamblers, the animals didn't pretend to know what was going on. They just knew that those were winners and they started copying them. And they copied them for 3 years. And obviously they realized early on, oh my goodness, their games refereed by Tim Donaghy and Concannon's betting them. And they all knew that they were buddies. They wrongly assumed that there was sort of a conspiracy between Concannon and Donaghy. There wasn't. He was just placing the bets for Donaghy. But regardless, that's how it started. And then you get to 06-07, Donaghy complains about Jack Concannon not paying him. Batista steps in and starts getting the bets directly. As a pro gambler, he realizes, okay, well, I can manipulate the market much better if I get them a day early. So they start manipulating the lines and getting way more money down. Well, for our purposes, and an answer to your question, Tom, the lines move a lot more. So even if you want to say that investigators for the NBA or the FBI maybe couldn't have been that nuanced from 03 to 06, my goodness, by 06-07, it's screaming. So much so that pro gamblers, having nothing to do with the conspiracy, they start copying the bets just because they're seeing the lines.
There's a copycat or a snowball effect in this.
That's it.
They keep hitting on these and they're moving the markets so much. Yeah. They got to know something.
Yeah. And then, look, there was another, I can't keep track off the top of my head, but there was another recent scandal where that is literally what got it flagged, that the line moved so much that they stopped betting on it. U.S. Integrity flagged, may have been maybe the Temple University basketball game against.
Yes. Yeah. There's the watchdog U.S. Integrity firm had flagged a couple of these.
But that didn't happen at any time during the NBA betting scandal where it could have.
All right. So when Tim Donaghy is making these bets on his own games, he's betting how much? Just ballpark figure. Well,
okay. Before that, good question. From 03 to 06, he was betting usually $5,000 a game.
Okay.
Of his own, but don't forget, back then, it's his own money. And what winds up happening, you get to 06, 07. And by the way, with regard to how much he bets, he disagrees with all of this. We're simply going by what informant said. So like, for instance, when we say that he was betting $5,000 before 06, 07, that's what Kincannon was betting. So we don't know what percentage of that was Kincannon versus what percentage of that was Donaghy. From 06, 07, for the 06, 07 season, he didn't have to pay on losses. And so he was just going to get whatever Batista. Yeah, he was on a free roll, which is that's another. This is an inside baseball or inside basketball, I guess, part of the NBA betting scandal story. Donaghy claims that he bet as much or more from 03, 06 than he did in 06, 07, which the idea that you have a free roll where you're not going to pay on any losses and you're getting paid $2 to $5 grand a game for winners and nothing on losers, and you're actually going to bet less that season. I mean, by the way, for your audience, they don't know. He also claims he was a gambling addict. He will be the only gambling addict in history who had access to unlimited money and bet less than he did when he had to pay on losers.
That's a great point. Yeah. So he's betting, let's just say 4 figures or less than that. Okay.
Yeah.
What is Jimmy Batista betting?
Well, I shouldn't say only, $1 million or $2 million a game. And the reason I always say only $2 million is because the market can only handle so much money. Obviously, if your sports book's taking that action, you have to find money on the other side to offset the bets. So he would bet as much as the market could take, and he's usually between $1 million and $2 million. But importantly, when I got access to Batista's betting records before then, I mean, he was betting more than the average Joe, but it was only tens of thousands of dollars per NBA games. But then there were Donaghy games, and it was, through the roof, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars on every Donaghy game. And it's for a reason. They were the games that he was fixing.
And they had a nickname for Tim Donaghy.
Well, he called him Elvis for the king because he was the king. Yeah.
So what is similar about the Tim Donaghy story and what is different? This Jontay Porter thing.
Well, for me, we talked earlier about early detection. As far as we know, it was not detected beforehand. That in of itself is an issue,
and David Purdom, great reporter for ESPN.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
All over this story. He got a statement from DraftKings, and it was, a few sentences. We'll get into that in a sec. And then also, he reached out to the NBA, and the NBA said, we're looking into it. But it wasn't, the NBA wasn't doing a victory lap here and being like, haha, we found this guy, and, we're self-policing this thing. This is why, you should trust us here. We caught this. It does seem to be that the DraftKings report the next day, you could see it there. And then DraftKings comes out with a statement being like, this is why, in general, legalization works. So you continue. You were saying that the difference between the two.
Well, the thing is, that is a big difference because one thing you and I didn't talk about a moment ago, which is I don't rule out that Donaghy couldn't happen today. Because a lot of these things really have been flagged, either by sports books or by third parties. So in many ways, the new system is working. I'll say this. I'm speaking only for myself. I have been surprised how many there have been, though. It is just unbelievable. I literally have a whole section on my website now just chronicling all of the scandals since we legalized. It's just been unrelenting. I knew there'd be a transition period, of course, but my goodness. And I'm just to be clear, Tom, you asked at the very beginning of this, does the Tim Donaghy thing come up? The number one way it comes up is that people keep telling me, Tim Donaghy was just the first. There's a big difference between an NBA official fixing dozens of games over 4 NBA seasons versus people gambling for anything. But fixing games is totally different than actually just betting on your own games, which is bad enough, or giving inside information, which is bad enough. So to me, the NBA scandal to this day is still way, way bigger than any of this.
Oh, yeah. Way bigger, for sure. I'm not trying to equate the size of the
No, I understand. I'm just saying to your audience who's unfortunately, a lot of people are doing that. And by the way, I blame the media for that. Not you, of course, but people to this day, people still don't grasp what happened from 03 to 07 and how many people were victims. And when I say victims, I'm including players, coaches, managers, season ticket holders. I mean, so many people were impacted by that. But anyway, to answer your question, I think the new system is working in many ways. And by the way, one thing that we have to figure out, I'm starting to look into this because I don't know the answer. When you see a third party like U.S. Integrity flag something, or a sports book flag something, the ways that we're all learning how they're doing this, I want to see who contacts whom. I've looked into this briefly. I haven't spent a lot of time on it, but I will. I want to know, okay, well, who's responsible for reporting to whom? No one really knows the answer to that because we're all in this new territory here. But if a sportsworks flags something, are they required to notify a league? Are they required to refer to U.S. Integrity? Do they tell their local law enforcement? Do they tell the state police? And how does that all work depending on who finds out what?
Yeah, it's a great question because in this story, DraftKings was pretty out in front of this, being like, look, this is why we legalize gambling at the federal level because, we can police this. Yep. But when did the NBA know? Why did it take a month? For example, the first game with a bunch of irregularities was end of January. Yep. It's end of March now. So it's 2 months. And I guess you could say, hey, they waited for the second one to confirm they're like, hey, if this happens again, then we know something's up. And March 20, the game happens March 20. The same pattern of events happen. A flurry of attempted bets on the Jontay Porter unders happens. And not only does that happen in the first game and the second game, but he pulls himself out in both games. And that to me is the smoking gun where it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't happen in the league. Very rarely does it happen. And that's one of my next projects is to like figure out how often that happens. But there's too much smoke here, right?
Well, I think, look, I mean, not that they're looking for your opinion or mine, I guess, but I think they should have let us know after the first one. I mean, why?
When you say they, you mean the betting?
Well, yeah. I think going back to my point a moment ago, I think the betting people should have let the league know, and they should have they should have let all of us know, because that simple fact pattern. Yes, it's even more remarkable what happened a second time, but the first one was enough to let everyone know. Okay, look, this is exactly the sort of thing we're looking into. Maybe it's innocent, but we promised you transparency when we legalized sports gambling. Well, here's an example of us being honest brokers. And they didn't do that. And then, yeah, I'll give them credit for after the second time. But I mean, it was just so, and look, you and I are not alleging anything other than it is unbelievably remarkable the way that the fact pattern fits both games exactly the same. And the bets are exactly the same. I mean, it's just too perfect.
So when we go forward from here, what is the Sean Patrick Griffin policy that you would back when it comes to legalizing sports gambling at the federal level, knowing what you know about the Donaghy scandal and just the history of organized crime, white collar crime? There's this huge push in marketing and advertising to get people to bet NBA games and NFL, what have you, sports betting. Where do you go from here? Like, what do you think the league should do here?
How much time do you have? No, I'm kidding. The problem, by the way, I'm sure you know that the people are asking for federal legislation and the feds to regulate it. That would be really problematic. I mean, because
in what sense? Explain that.
Well, the whole idea is right now, different states regulate different things. You know, some states allow this, some states don't allow that. Going back to the reporting thing, some states report to the state police, others go right to the Fed. It's all over the place. And so some people have wanted a more streamlined, structured version of that for all of our all the states that have legalized gambling. I can't imagine that happening just because there are so many people who've invested so much money in each individual state to get their regulations the way they like them. I just don't see that happening. But with regard to the leagues, I'm serious about what I said a moment ago. I think they should have let everyone know that first day. And you can say that without alleging any criminality or anything unethical. You can just say, look, this is exactly what we're worried about. People are betting on these things. Or put it this way, you know how the NCAA said that they want to get rid of prop bets. I don't think that would ever happen in the pros, but that's my point. If you're not going to do that, fine, we're all grown-ups here, but that requires then you to have a really high degree of transparency when it comes to something like this. And something I said at the beginning of our interview, I don't know what systems are in place to track, not the prop bets per se, but the activities on a basketball court or a tennis court or on a football field or whatever. that lead to prop bets. I used the dumb foot fault example earlier in our discussion. Whatever those are for each individual sport, I don't know who's tracking that. You do a good job doing the analytics, but you're one person with one data set. I'm saying you really
I don't have access to the NBA's files.
Exactly. Well, you don't have access to most of the stuff. But what I'm saying is we're here now years after this. And my gosh, 13 years after the NBA betting scandal, we still have no idea what they're tracking. And so as always, we're having to rely on them being honest brokers that know we're monitoring this stuff. I don't know that. You know what I mean? Like with regard to the prop bets, I don't know what they're monitoring with that because they don't tell us.
Yeah. Do you think there will be a pullback on the marketing and the advertising? I don't know where you stand on how much you see of it now of gambling. Sign up now, get 300 in free bets or whatever. To me, it feels like we're begging for a scandal when we're trying to make this seem like you had an ESPN anchor basically saying this is a risk-free investment on air, and yet ESPN has is ESPN Bet. They've licensed their brand to a sports book, and you have people, very famous people on your air, basically say it's risk-free investing, and he walked that back and apologized. But it just seems like we're going way too fast right now.
Well, I don't know if you've seen the stats. I mean, that's the sort of thing I do follow. Not only has legalized gambling exploded, it keeps exploding every year. It's not growing up incrementally each year. It's exploding every year. And one of the things that I hypothesized years ago, one of the arguments for legalization of gambling is very much like the legalization of marijuana. People always argue, and of course they say it to me as the organized crime guy, no, we want to keep organized crime. We want to keep the underworld out of these markets, so we're going to legalize it. But what people don't realize when they're arguing for legalization, by definition, if you legalize it, you're going to regulate it and you're going to tax it, which by definition increases the cost to the consumer, which by definition creates a black market. That's just basic economics. You don't need to be an expert on that, which is why, by the way, with marijuana, you're seeing huge scandals in Oklahoma, huge scandals in California with all the underground marijuana. Well, now with legalized sports gambling, the black market has exploded. People thought that the pie was, that was finite and that, okay, the legalization was going to consume, and by definition, the illegal market would constrict. Well, no, the pie just got bigger. And so now the illegal market's bigger, and so is the legal gambling market. So I don't see any end in sight to this, and it also legalization came at a rough time too, because don't forget, it was right before COVID, right before the lockdowns, right before, we started seeing all sort of social ills where people couldn't leave their homes for a while. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, the economy struggled. So it hit at the perfect time for people who really don't gamble responsibly.
So when you see Adam Silver or any other commissioner saying it's better to bring these things into the sunlight, your reaction is what? Like the underground market, the illegal market, the reason why you bring this up and above board is so that we can catch and police any wrongdoing and protect the integrity of the game. Do they have a point? Is the idea that legalizing will make things tougher for Tim Donaghy and whomever is behind the Jontay Porter thing, if there is something there, and the Shohei Ohtani, that if we hadn't legalized gambling at the federal level, it would be 10 times as bad than what you're saying. Because I don't know. I think it's important to note that the Shohei Ohtani thing, he was dealing with an illegal bookie.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of in this gray area of we're in this legalized sports gambling era, but this scandal is happening because I think the California or the Los Angeles prosecution or some sort of investigations department was looking into Wayne Nix, another illegal bookie or gambler ring.
And by the way, and that one is tied to Las Vegas, which is another illegal booking operation, which involves former athletes. But it's all illegal. Even though we've got legalized gambling, that particular scandal is entirely underground.
Which doesn't look, it flies in the face of the argument of like legalizing will weed this stuff out. If there's in legal markets, people are still booking with illegal bookings.
Well, the thing is that for your listeners who don't know this, in case you're saying, well, I don't understand. If I can bet legally, why would I bet illegally?
Yes.
One of the main reasons is because your local bookmaker will let you bet on credit, whereas a legal sports book will say, no, you owe me $1,000 or you're paying. It's already in you already gave us your credit card and it's it. You're allowed to bet on credit, and sometimes they'll give you better odds. They'll give you better deals. There are many things that would persuade you to bet illegally. So that's why.
Which is why Shohei Ohtani's interpreter might be underwater by $4.5 million is because he's probably like, I can't pay this back. And you're in the hole and it just grows and grows and grows. And suddenly, hey, Shohei, I'm just paraphrasing or just hypothetical. Hey, I need some help here. I need you to wire $4.5 million and then I'll be done. You know, that doesn't happen at a legal at FanDuel or at MGM.
Well, and the other thing too, that legal sports books will put limits, of course, on what you can bet, and your local bookmaker or a good illegal bookmaker will let you bet a lot of money. So there are many reasons that people go underground, but so there's been no lack of that the last few years either. But to answer your question, I don't know if it's better or worse now that we have that. As I said earlier, I've been surprised at how many scandals there've been. I mean, depending on your perspective, I don't know if they're minor. It's mostly like college athletes betting. You may have seen the big expose where a former NCAA athlete gave a long interview to ESPN where he alleged that he was actually running an illegal bookmaking operation when he was playing in college, and that all of his clientele was athletes at the time. They were betting on their own games. And this is when it was illegal anyway. So that, we're never going to know how much of this was happening before, and we just didn't know about it. And now it's in the limelight, and we're focusing on the fact that sports gambling is legalized. And by the way, one of the other things too, we now have reporters whose only beat is gambling. That's new. So there's reason to believe we're actually learning more because they actually are doing this all the time where they didn't have that beat before.
Yeah, the whole Pete Rose thing about how he only bet on his games to win. It didn't land well with me. It's something I hadn't really considered, and maybe you brought this up to me or my attention, or someone else did. But if you decide not to bet on a game, the implication is, I don't like this game. I'm not betting on this. I'm only betting on winners. I'm only betting to win. But if you don't bet, the signal is out there to your bookie or to whomever. The implication is you don't have to bet to send a message, is what I'm trying to say. Right?
Yeah.
So Pete Rose, where does this fit into the story of all the taxonomy of sports gambling controversies and investigations and scandals? The Jontay Porter thing is different than the Pete Rose thing, which is different than the Shohei Ohtani thing. But where is the Pete Rose one? I know you didn't write a book about Pete Rose, but your understanding of that one and how it fits into the larger picture.
Well, see, you just made the point for me, though. I think that one's incredibly important. I mean, it's different than what I wrote about Donaghy because I have argued for years that he was actively fixing games for outcomes. Pete Rose may not have been doing that, but he was absolutely telling people through his actions what he was doing, whether he bet or not. The fact that he wasn't betting is itself an issue. That's why, by the way, in law enforcement, many people may know I'm a former police officer. That's why many departments frown upon people taking gratuities. It's for that reason. They don't want people to develop these relationships and these patterns where their behavior changes as a result of their connections. And so with Pete Rose, how does he fit into this? I mean, look, you can't say that it's not one of the more consequential scandals, even though he was not, apparently not fixing games. I mean, it's still a remarkable story.
What is the thing that to this day riles you up about the way people talk about Tim Donaghy and the story about Tim Donaghy? And we'll leave on this. You're fine. The floor is yours if you'd like to just vent about the Tim Donaghy scandal and how it's being talked about in 2024.
My biggest gripe is that people treat the NBA betting scandal as a he said story, as if we're never actually going to know the truth. Well, co-conspirator Martino says this, co-conspirator Batista says that, and Donaghy says this.
Who could know? Yeah.
It's just, and I, on Twitter, I routinely say, look, we're not It's not 2007 any longer. That may have been fine when the story broke, but my goodness, we've had access to a trove of data. The cases went through the courts. We had discovery. There's no reason for all this supposition. We know what happened. There are basic things that are not in dispute, by the way, by all parties. And so that's one of my big problems. The other thing is when people, as I said earlier, talk about what the FBI did or didn't do. I interviewed the people in the FBI. I interviewed the people at the U.S. Attorney's Office. By the way, the public doesn't know any of their names. They were never in the news. They could never speak publicly about this. So, and the problem is people love giving Tim Donaghy a microphone. And here's the thing. I don't knock that. I understand that people need clicks and views and all that sort of stuff. I would prefer they didn't do it, but I'm not naive. I get that. I get that people take it seriously. And now I'm talking about the sports media people who are actually, they'll get in conversations with me or whatever. And a lot of times they'll talk to me and they'll have an attitude. And they'll not realize that the entire premise for their argument or their question is false because they listen to that idiot. That's the thing that gets me most animated. Like he's allowed to do whatever he likes, but my goodness, you're supposed to be a professional journalist and I'm answering this question. Do you even know why you're asking that question?
Yeah, it's in that Untold Netflix documentary, he has these claims about how I knew that this coach had a vendetta with this team and this player, and so I knew bet against the Miami Heat or Pat Riley or something like that. But if you actually do watch the game and chart the calls, whatever he said on that documentary, the opposite was true. He was blaming this referee hates this coach. And so I know bet against, that team because he really has an axe to grind against this coach. When in fact, that referee was very fair in his calls for and against. The one that was very lopsided was actually Donaghy himself, which is not the story he was telling on the documentary.
Well, see, the thing is, though, for your viewers and your readers, especially if you read what you do, you're one of the few people who does this. And that's really the problem. And I think I'm preaching to the choir with your audience because they know you. What Tom does is rare and unique. That's the problem. By the way, I'm not discounting you, Tom, of course. I'm saying, though, that's supposed to be journalism. Well, if he makes a claim, he's not talking about 6th century Rome. He's talking about things that happen now on tape. You can look at them, and people don't. So Tom did it with aspects of actual basketball. But see, Tom, you understand the problem, though. For you to write a column on that or do a podcast, it's hours and hours of research. He can say something in one sentence that takes you days to debunk. Yeah. That's been my experience. Now I'm not focusing so much on the basketball. I'm doing the gambling stuff. And it's the same thing. And what I get all the time is, I don't know if I told you this on one of my previous appearances. Years ago, I tried getting the website yeahbut.com. Because with Gaming the Game, it came out and I would debunk this. And the host would say, yeah, but. And it's okay, fine. But no, that's wrong too. And here's the data on that. Yeah, but. And we would do that for an entire episode. I would never actually get to explain what actually happened because I was dealing with all the BS that they started with. Mm-hmm. And they say, yeah, but. And there was never an end to the yeah, buts.
Right. And if you haven't already been on Amazon.com to buy his book, you got to do it now. It is a must-have, not just if you're an NBA fan, but if you're in this legalization of sports gambling era and feel like your head is spinning and you want to understand how this stuff works, Gaming the Game. It's the story behind the NBA betting scandal and the gambler who made it happen by Sean Patrick Griffin, the author of Black Brothers Inc. And that is Sean Patrick Griffin in that interview. Anything you want to plug? I just mentioned the 2 books, but anything else, any works that you want people to know about, or just in general, something you're into and want people to hear about?
Nothing cooking right now, but I would like it if people could either visit my website, which is SeanPatrickGriffin.net or .com. It's the same thing. Sean is S-E-A, you see it on screen, S-E-A-N, Patrick, G-R-I-F-F-I-N, if you're just listening. And my Twitter feed is SPG Author. I don't post a lot. My kids tell me I have a very boring Twitter feed. But typically speaking, it's criticism of the media and trying to correct people politely about the scandal. And by the way, thank you very much for the kind words, Tom. For people who don't know about Gaming the Game, yes, it's about the NBA betting scandal, but as Tom alluded to, it talks a lot about the architecture of how gambling works, either at sports books and offshore. That's why it's been helpful as legalization has happened and more people are getting involved in gambling.
There you have it. Sean, thank you so much for joining the Finder Pod. And, there's so many stories that I want to research and dig into. I just have to find the time. And that is really what we need to do, is find more time rather than finding things. We need to just find more time. So, so much to get into that, so many ideas for research and checking the facts and fact checking. So thank you so much for joining me. And you'll be on again soon. I'm sure of it, given the rapid speed and the acceleration of these things that keep popping up. So thanks again.
I look forward to it. Thanks, Tom.